Hello everybody, so today I decided to make a quick video about what is probably a rather hot topic in the community at the moment, and that is of course what the Grand Architect's actual power is, since apparently, according to some new information, it is not exactly the shapeshifting that we envisioned before. So the reason why, of course, that we are having this sort of discourse in the first place is because with the latest Denia story, as you guys can probably imagine, it was a very good story. Denia, before she died, did tell us one very important detail, that two things, actually. Not just an important detail, two things, that firstly, the Grand Architect's true forte is not actually shapeshifting, and the second thing is that the shapeshifting that the Grand Architect performs needs long-term observation and analysis of a target to pull off. And this is really the first clue that we've gotten about the Grand Architect's powers for a very, very, very long time. Because for all intents and purposes, all we've known about the Grand Architect is that they shapeshift. That's really all we kind of know about what they do, right? So before we kind of go into some more discussions about what the Grand Architect is, what their power is, as well as also what new observations we can glean from Denia's words to us, I want to quickly talk about a couple of things, right? The first thing is that we need to do a bit of a spot check, right? About what appearances the Grand Architect has taken on thus far. As you guys can see on the screen, first off, we have Triss. This is the first illusion, I guess you could say, we've had of the Grand Architect. And the second one that we saw, I think it was in 2.6 and 2.7, is Kara, right? Who is an avatar based on the real historical figure of Charon, the ferryman of the dead within Greek mythology, and Galbrana and Rover themselves say that Charon, the Grand Architect's illusion, is based on Septimonian imagery and culture and mythology, right? Next one we saw, of course, is Leon. So this was during Cholyun's quest in 2.7, where he took the appearance of this acolyte, right? The most recent one we've seen, kind of like visually at least, is of course Luke's father within his Segway quest, but within lore and whatnot, we've also had two other confirmed sightings, the other one being Cholyun's teacher, Grandmaster Liang Dongyun, and that's why, of course, that he visibly saw Leon, right, because he recognized the frequency. And then we also had that one lady in Hiyuki's story, who kind of like transformed the Grand Architect when Hiyuki was trying to clear up the lost beyond, not the lost beyond, the lost spirits of Hanami City. So the next thing I want to talk about is one of the very first conclusions I came to after Denia gave us the two new bits of information about the Grand Architect in 3.3, and that is about Triss, right? Because if we go all the way back to 2.5 with the Frolova story, one thing that's very interesting is that, well, we now know that the Grand Architect needs long-term observation of their target in order to actually copy them. And with these characters, like for example, Luke's father, with Leon, with Charon, with like Liang Dongyun, as well as also kind of like the lady in Hiyuki story, that kind of makes sense because either we don't know about the past of these characters, or there could have been an opportunity for the Grand Architect to essentially observe them for an extended duration without any real sort of foul play, right? But Triss is the exception, because the thing we have to kind of understand is that Frolova only awakened her power when she died, when the meteor hit her village, Astina, right? And it was an undisclosed, rather long amount of time that Frolova first came into contact with the Grand Architect during the end of one of her concerts, right? But if the Grand Architect was able to copy Triss, that means that while Triss was still alive, then the Grand Architect may have basically set Frolova up, right? Because there is no conceivable way, unless the Grand Architect has some sort of precognition, that they could have known that Frolova would awaken her power and thus deem that Triss would be a valuable target in order to copy, right? So we really have to consider that perhaps the meteor incident is not really some random manufactured tragedy. The only real justification I can think that possibly the Grand Architect could have copied Triss is that since Frolova carries the frequencies of the people of the village, she could have, like, the Grand Architect could have copied that frequency, but I don't think the physical long-term observation would have worked out regardless, right? So what that means is that we reach basically one of the first of many observations that to make about the Grand Architect, right? Because if Frolova's recruitment into the Fraxis was most likely not an accident, because a Grand Architect has probably been setting Frolova up, right? Since she can copy Triss, she probably copied Triss when Triss, of course, was still alive, then that would mean that the Grand Architect knew that Frolova would be valuable or would have a very powerful forte before she actually awoke. And that means that the Grand Architect most likely has some sort of precognition of perhaps the forte and powers of someone that would awaken before they actually do, case in point being Frolova. Since it really doesn't make sense, since Frolova awoke her forte when she died in the meteor, there would be no reason for the Grand Architect to copy Triss's appearance over extended duration if they didn't know about Triss before, or if they didn't know that Frolova would awaken as such. So they possibly have some sort of precognition of, like, how powerful someone would be before they actually awaken. That's the first observation. The second thing I have to talk about is that we have to kind of, like, go away from Frolova and talk back to Denia for a second, right? So one thing I have kind of, like, on the screen here that you can kind of, like, see is that Denia, right, was a vessel for the Frenodian Aleph-1. We all know that, right? But one thing that a lot of people may not know is the reason why Denia is so emotionless and she is canonically trying to imitate being a human rather than trying to be a human themselves is that the Fraxis tried to actually make Denia as empty of a person as possible, both emotionless as well as also nihilistic, right? The reason why was because a hollow shell would be the most effective vessel for Aleph-1, right? The one thing a hollow shell feels towards themselves in the world more than anything is nothingness, a quality that perfectly aligns with Aleph-1's logic of existence. The problem is that even though Denia was empty at the beginning, we know that she eventually grew a heart, right? And the reason why that was a problem for the Fraxis is that the more emotional, the more human Denia gets, the worse the resonance between Denia and the Frenodian actually get, right? And if you actually talk to Armand after, for example, the story, one thing you can kind of see is that the Fraxis realized that that whole Denia experiment project, Frenodian Resonator project, was actually a failure years before the story in 3.3 actually played out. They knew from the start that Aleph-1 could never descend upon Solaris, and also the experiment was successful, but they were dissatisfied with the outcome because they knew that year by year, Denia's resonance was actually decreasing, right? So they had a very long kind of, like, foreshadowing that the Lahiroi project was a de facto failure, and that's why they kind of, like, pulled out of the Dimmer Plains a really long time ago, actually, right? And that brings us to kind of, like, one very interesting thing, is that even though they knew it would be a failure, the Grand Architect still stayed as Navora for all of these years, even after these researchers basically pulled out, right? And the reason why we know that is because, well, the Navora can't just disappear, because if Navora disappears, then Sagrika would know that Navora can't be a friend across all these years, right? And the question I want you guys to be asking is that if the Grand Architect knew that this whole project was going to fail, yet Navora was still remaining as Sagrika's friend for all these years, why would they even do that for a failed project? Well, that brings us to our second observation. And the second observation basically operates on the foundation that we know that the Lahiroi Denia project was a failure, but the Grand Architect still chose to stay as Navora for years afterwards, which most likely implies, to me at least, that their power allows them to be at multiple places at once. They wouldn't really waste time, like, LARPing as Navora and literally adhering to a school schedule if their end goal was taking over the world, right? I do believe, however, that even though they can be in multiple places at once, they are probably limited to some capacity with how much avatars they can control. The reason why is because, I think you can kind of see, no, I didn't post it. The reason why is because if you remember from the end of the 3.3.1 story, I think it was, the Grand Architect told Cristoforo to kill Navora, right? Kill off that avatar. So there is probably some sort of incentive for the Grand Architect to get rid of an avatar once they become useless, right? But the key kind of takeaway here, for now at least, is that they can control multiple people and probably be in multiple places, at least in a way where investing in Navora as an avatar, as a body for all those years in Lahairo, even though they knew it was a failure, was not actually as big of a loss as appears on the surface, right? So the next thing we have to talk about is Choyun. So from Choyun's fourth story, we actually learn a little bit about his master, so Liang Dongyun, right? So it's a bit of the Grand Master, and we can kind of see that the reason why the Choyun has this sort of like relation with the Grand Architect is because they've actually seen them take on the form of their Grand Master teacher, right? And what's really interesting here is that this is the only time in the story where we've seen one of the Grand Architect's avatars actually kind of die, right? We've never seen otherwise with any of the other bodies, whether that is Charon, whether that is, for example, Navora, whether that is Leon, stuff like that, one of their avatars dying, right? But in Choyun's story, we can actually see, do you still recall the fiend that peeled themselves from Dongyun's body, right? So we actually see a description of what happens when the Grand Architect exits or destroys one of its avatars. It emerges as a kind of fiend, right? And what's really interesting is that this implies that the Grand Architect seems to be able to exit the body as if it's kind of like a shell that takes over, right? And perhaps the more primal and more basic form is some kind of spirit or frequency that is only really just temporarily inhabiting the said body. So the only thing that kind of like the original spirit of fiend has a frequency with is with Choyun, right? Because Choyun actually recognizes the same frequency from Dongyun with Leon, right? That's why he says, your disguise means nothing to me, I recognize your frequency, right? So the fiend obviously has a separate frequency to the target. So they have like basically a base frequency that's different from kind of like people, right? And that's why Choyun can kind of like detect them basically. So that brings us to the third observation, right? Which is that there is actually a possibility that Grand Architect's ability is not really shapeshifting, but perhaps some sort of takeover or control or puppeteering ability, right? It has been hinted, of course, that the Grand Architect frequently disposes of their bodies. We talked about this already, because the Grand Architect did tell Cristoforo to get rid of Navora, right? Get rid of this body. So there's probably some sort of incentive for them to do that. But Choyun's story actually gives us a clue that when this body is destroyed or is expended, there's some sort of spirit or fiend with a frequency that peels away from it. And that might even perhaps be the Grand Architect's true form. We don't know, for example, what that implies for their powers, or if they're a shape-shifting spirit that possesses bodies or whatnot. Like, we don't know for now, right? But the next observation we need to make as well, before we start going into kind of like the theories, is that the Grand Architect's abilities may very well be linked to the service of their ideology. And if you remember or have watched my video on basically the Grand Architect's kind of like mentality and stuff like that, you'll notice that they have a very survival, results-oriented way of thinking, an ideology, if you will. And it's most likely that their power is in some way, shape, or form either assisting or basically to the ends of this way of thinking, right? And we actually get that basically confirmed with Denia, where Denia basically says the Grand Architect has nothing left but mere survival, right? So they do basically anything possible, like weaponizing Frenodians, like kind of like doing terrible things, like for example, splicing humans of TDs, because they want to survive, right? So it wouldn't really be surprising if the power they have themselves is to the end service of this goal. So now we can start getting to the fun part of the video, where we start speculating, of course, if shapeshifting is a derivative of the Grand Architect's power, then we can put on our tinfoil hats, as you can see here, and start thinking about what the main ability actually is, right? I have a couple of theories. Of course, take this with a grain of salt. These are just theories. I have a lot of options, but after the end of this, hopefully you guys possibly get a greater idea, or maybe are inspired to make some theories of your own, right? So the very first theory I have is division and creation, right? So in essence, what this basically is that we step back a step and think about the fact that possibly the Grand Architect's ability isn't really shapeshifting, but perhaps a Grand Architect's ability is really just one of division, right? They are really dividing their main body. They only have one body, but they're dividing that main body and planting them in important places around the world to kind of act like sleeper agents. So like, for example, the Grand Master, Choyun's teacher, and I don't know, like maybe Yang Yang if she ends up being like really sus, whatever. But this is basically, let's just say the Grand Architect splitting their main body into 20 smaller independently operating bodies, and basically kind of like biding their time and, you know, like molding into society and stuff like that, right? And of course, the big advantage of this theory is that it very easily explains how they can be in multiple places at once, right? Also, perhaps it explains why it's in their interest to kill off parts of their body that no longer have a purpose, like Navora, in order to conserve energy, with, for example, that body maybe returning to one of the other main bodies to kind of like, you know, be used elsewhere or whatnot, right? They need to conserve energy. They have some sort of limitation that way, because if they split their body into too many pieces and each of the individual pieces get weaker or something, right? And this is another thing that you may not kind of think about, is that this division and creation kind of ability would definitely link to the fact that they are really incredibly old. We know they're really old because they have links to all the way back to the original Court of Cervantes committee as Wei Ying, as well as also kind of like knowing Rover comes from a different civilization. They gotta be old to know that, right? All of that combined kind of like shows that it would be very advantageous if they were a very old being, because the older you are, the more you can meddle in with the future, all right? You can plant a sleeper agent or something in, for example, a city that has just started, like Jinzhou or something, and in the centuries that follow, when that city becomes prosperous or whatever, you may have your sleeper agent acting in a very high rank or office, right? So, considering that Galbrenner described Swarzlosh, or the Grand Architect, as a thousand-faced survivor, it really kind of like this, of course, really fits the ethos of doing anything necessary to survive, because splitting your body into multiple pieces, of course, increases your survival odds in totality, right? And the second thing, of course, is that this power, considering if it is division oriented and really depend on being on a lot of places at once, it would definitely encourage a lot of long-term planning and schemes, which is, of course, something we know the Grand Architect loves to do, because it takes a lot of time to integrate people into certain places. It's not just Rover, but also the Grand Architect that loves to play the long game, right? So stuff like, for example, the Grand Master that taught Choyun, as well as also like the really long-term effort to recruit Frolova, right? Because like the time between when Frolova died and when she was eventually recruited could have been centuries, right? They are really kind of like making early investments, I guess you can say. And it may also be possible that in order to kind of like base like subsections or new parts of their body off of, for example, kind of like a different person, they need to observe them for a long time in order to actually mold that body into, for example, kind of like a new one, right? And that would, of course, explain very specifically why the GA is capable of copying not just physical, you know, like humans, but also concepts like Charon as frequencies. because they would need to analyze a target before dividing themselves and kind of like shape-shifting that divided part into a new thing, right? So that's the first theory. The second theory is puppeteering or parasitism or some sort of like symbiosis, whatever you want to call it, right? You can kind of see, if you know Star Trek, this is the Borg Queen. And the reason why I posted a picture of the Borg Queen is because the Borg Queen has a very similar survival method to this, right? So the whole puppeteering or parasitism theory is based on the idea that the Grand Architect is no longer truly human in the physical sense, but really only kind of acts as a kind of spiritual parasite to take over these dead or existing people as a sort of spirit or frequency, rather than actually making or kind of like shape-shifting into a body themselves, right? And the reason why I came up with this theory is because it lines up really well with Choyun's description of what happened to Grandmaster Liang Dongyun, right? Because when he says, do you recall the fiend that pulled itself from Dongyun's body? The fiend may be a kind of spirit or like a raw form of the Grand Architect, right? Because they wouldn't really describe it as a fiend if it was not like a specific person, because all of the Grand Architects, like sort of like appearances or disguises, aren't really like that terribly ugly. Like maybe other than Charon, but like I can't imagine Charon pulling themselves off of a person, right? So I really do believe that the fiend may be some sort of like evil spirit, right? And if that is the case, then that means that the Grand Architect in their most basic form is a kind of spirit or frequency before it takes over someone's body, right? And the other thing that really supports the parasitism theory is this idea that if the Grand Architect has a power that really is parallel to their ideology of survival above nothing else, then this is basically one of the ultimate survival methods, right? Like shedding your fragile physical body to be a kind of like hopping and like, hopping parasite that depends on other people to live is a pretty effective method, right? Because if the host dies, you just have to jump to the next one. Like you yourself are not harmed. And then like when I was writing this PowerPoint, what I was really reminded of was if you kind of check the back kind of like dress of like the old Denia's altar form, you see this like this kind of like message that says, my flesh is a cage, right? And assuming, like the Fraxis designed Denia's clothes, it wouldn't really surprise me that, like the Grand Architect had a bit of or the Grand Architect or the ideology had a bit of a part to play when it came to this message, my flesh is a cage, right? And when you really think about it, if the Grand Architect is basically like this parasite hive mind controlling like a lot of different people in a lot of different places, then that's like as we said before, the ultimate survival strategy, because you could never kill them unless you destroyed every single parasite. And this would be something that the Grand Architect could do to a much larger degree than, for example, division and creation, because if you were to divide your main body, then you expend much more energy than basically just acting as a parasite and taking over someone else's body, not having to expend the energy of making a new body, right? So hopefully that's all making sense so far. I'm going to go on to our next theory, which is kind of like, for example, memory to frequency creation conversion. But before we go on to that, I think I did put this slide here. Look just says, to an immortal like you, no matter how many times you die, it's just another lost identity. And I happen to have seen you die before. So, of course, we can see that, Look alongside Choyun has seen the Grand Architect per se die. But like the way that Look saw his father die was really kind of like in like being like buried in like a funeral and like sort of stuff like that. And then the Grand Architect escaped later, because if you remember from Look's trailer, the grave was empty, right? So Look didn't really see Swazlosh or the Grand Architect die for real. But I thought it was like an interesting thing to add here, that no matter how many times you die, it's just another lost identity. Like, if the Grand Architect was a parasite, they would definitely see, for example, bodies as expendable, because parasites don't take up a lot of energy to make, right? So yeah, anyhow, let's go on to the next theory, which is memory to frequency creation slash conversion. And this is the idea that the Grand Architect has the ability to basically turn a memory or central stimuli, so basically visual stimuli or like frequency-based stimuli or whatever, into a frequency of their own, right? So instead of it kind of like looking like they're shapeshifting, what they're actually doing is that they're creating a new frequency or converting a memory or something into a like frequency, right? Into something that is tangibly real. And this is one of the best theories to explain Dania's point that she gave us in 3.3, that the Grand Architect needs long-term observation or contact of a target to perform, you know, like this shapeshifting. Because if they need long-term conversion, that perfectly explains why, right? They need to, if they want to copy a frequency based off of like memory or like some sort of like central stimuli, then of course they need to like, you know, observe something for a long time in order to know how to copy and create it, right? And it also explains how they can create concepts, like not even physically real things, like concepts like Charon, and turn those into physical manifestations. So the other thing as well that was rather interesting is that if you remember from 3.2, during one of the last cutscenes when Navora speaks to Dania, you can kind of see this over here, Navora was really interested in memory type resonators. How far can memory type resonators go before its power consumes them? Its, I'm assuming, is Aleph-1, but regardless of that, you can kind of still see that the GA has a weird obsession with memory type resonators, like Lucilla, right? And as such, it's probably rather a interesting theory, at least, to take, right? The other thing as well that has really stayed unanswered is, of course, at the very beginning of this video, we talked about how the Grand Architect most likely has some sort of precognition, because if they set Frolova up, per se, right, and essentially was able to copy Triss before Triss actually died, then the GA may, of course, have analyzed, for example, Triss's frequency. Yes, that's a theory. But if they really did set Frolova up, if they're really playing the long game, then the Grand Architect's kind of like, you know, precognition may tie into the fact that they can see the potential of a person who is not awakened yet, like Frolova, because their ability is so dependent on frequency, right? Like maybe, for example, the Grand Architect happened to walk by Frolova's village, they kind of like were able to view her frequency, and they were just like, oh shit, you know, like if this girl dies, she's going to become like a giga powerful resonator, like whatever, right? It would be something that ties into the kind of like this idea pretty well, right? And you can kind of see over here as well, Luke does say, the Fraxless Grand Architect. Their true name is unknown, they only appear through borrowed identities. Real people, legendary beings, and even phantoms of the dead from others' memories, right? So, all of these things, right, all of these kind of like things that the Grand Architect can turn into are things that are based on some sort of central stimuli or memories, right? And that, of course, is basically one thing that really supports this theory. So, next thing is going to be one that goes completely away from the three other theories I talked about before. And this is a theory that I like to call the Akashic Library theory, right? If you guys don't know what the Akashic Library is, the Akashic Library, you can kind of see in the second point here, is in kind of like some belief systems, a sort of compendium or like library per se, of all the conceivable knowledge, past, present, and future, that exists within the world, right? And the reason why I use the Akashic Library as a bit of reference to describe this theory is because it's a possibility that if the GA's ability to shapeshift is a derivative of their main ability, then maybe their main ability actually has very little to do with shapeshifting at all, and their forte is something that is more base and more prime or more powerful, right? And that's why I want to propose that it's actually possible that the Grand Architect may have a forte that has to do with gaining and manifesting knowledge from the past, present, and future, right? You can kind of see this picture here. I wish you a pleasant past, present, and future. They seem to be very obsessed with the concept of dimensions and time, right? And when you kind of look at, for example, how the Grand Architect loves to plan things in advance and play the centuries-long long game, if their forte was related to some sort of precognition or like knowledge, then that would make sense, right? And on the topic of precognition, this is the only theory of the four that I presented that fully explains how the Grand Architect could have known about Frolova becoming a powerful resonator and, potentially setting her up before she even awoke her forte, right? Because if she has this sort of, per se, Akashic Library ability to gain knowledge or have some precognition of the future, then of course they would make efforts to recruit Frolova, because she would be like a bomb-ass resonator in the future after a meteor like hit her village or some shit, right? So beyond that, we can also kind of see that having this knowledge or precognition would allow for some really opportunistic takeovers. Like, for example, how the Grand Architect took over Luke's father, right? And made him basically force research into the Ichor drug, found the, what was the organization called again? Like the company, a Novial Corporation, right? And found a Novial Corporation and do all that stuff, as well as also take over our Grandmaster Liang Dongyun, right? All these things are what I like to call opportunistic takeovers, and the Grand Architect, if they had some sort of precognition, they would be able to scout out these cases, right? Like Frolova, like Luke's father, like the Grandmaster. And it also kind of explains how, for example, the Grand Architect seems to be able to use, like other Fraxis members' abilities, like Scar's portals, because instead of, for example, just like copying them, they would be able to kind of like maybe use other people in the Fraxis, or for example, use other abilities after studying them for an extended duration, just like how they possibly need to study other people and to learn how to shapeshift into them, right? However, one of the things I find a bit interesting and maybe contrary to this theory is that even though the Grand Architect feels like they can do everything themselves, they actually cannot, right? In the end of 3.3.1, in the cutscene where the Grand Architect talks on a bunch of terminals to Cristoforo and an unknown voice, Cristoforo does ask if the Grand Architect needs them to write a prologue for their characters. So it does seem to me that perhaps Cristoforo needs to make some of the people that the Grand Architect is basically shapeshifting as, right? And perhaps the Grand Architect is really just learning all they can about somebody and feeding that information to Cristoforo perhaps in order to get him to make a body for them to inhibit, right? So that could of course really explain why shapeshifting is a derivative. It may be that it's not even a Grand Architect that's shapeshifting really, but another member of the Fraxis like Cristoforo making their characters and bodies for them, and the Grand Architect has their extensive knowledge to kind of like shape that person's identity and also kind of like maybe shape their frequency, right? And beyond that all, as we talked about before, the Grand Architect really does act like somebody who has a knowledge-based forte, if you know what I mean? Like the way they talk is like so obnoxiously culturally elitist and like esoteric and like just like planning in the future. You know what I mean, right? Like they definitely sound like someone who has a knowledge-based forte. So anyway, right? You have some sort of like things that are rather interesting here, is that even though the Grand Architect seems to know everything, there's one thing they can't replicate properly, and that is death, right? And when you kind of think about it, since the Grand Architect is so obsessed with survival, it makes sense that they would never know what death is like and possibly can't replicate it properly. And Luke even calls us out because your acting had been flawless, Grand Architect, but even you cannot mimic what you don't understand. Death itself, right? And since of course the Grand Architect is so obsessed with surviving, they've never died once, right? And that is kind of like perhaps one of the flaws of their character, is that with all their abundant extensive knowledge, they still can't replicate death itself. So that was a rather interesting thing, right? But beyond that, you can kind of also see that Navora, when her disguise was blown, said that they really liked really old and far, far away things, i.e. Rover, because Rover came from another civilization. And this is another thing that really pushes forward the idea that the Grand Architect seems to be someone that loves knowledge and has a lot of it as well. Yeah? So Beyond that, that is my current theories so far. There may be some other theories that I have not talked about, or some others that you guys have thought of, so feel free to place them in the comments. But that really is the extent of today's video. So anyways, hopefully you guys found this interesting. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to subscribe, donate in the comments, or even become a channel member, right? Besides that, dump anything you guys think that is interesting in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.